Cambodia, I actually feel really humbled. I feel really humbled because I am really impressed by the resilience of the Cambodian people. Despite the most difficult of circumstances that they have been through, it is truly amazing to look around me and, despite all of the challenges, see the rapid progress and development in Cambodia. What I would like to do today in my lecture is to focus on my area of expertise, which is China, and to share with you my take on the China model. As you all know, the China model is now a very hot topic, whether it's in the media or policy circles. Everyone is talking about the China model, and in fact, everyone has a different idea of the China model. So I'd like to share with you my take, and then at the end of my lecture, to share with you some thoughts and suggestions about lessons for countries like Cambodia, with the disclaimer that it is really you in the audience who will have the contextual knowledge and the expertise to apply the principles and the lessons to Cambodia's context. So let me begin. When we think about the China model, to most observers, the China model is very simple. It is a combination of top-down governance with massive infrastructure investments. Right? So this is the impression that you get if you just sort of go to visit China, look at Chinese presence in countries like Cambodia. And this type of impression is very commonly and widely expressed by visitors of developing countries to China. So this is an example of an essay published in the Global Times, a newspaper in China, by a Nigerian visitor. He works in the vice president's office. And in this essay, he talks about the China model with almost a tone of awe. And he says, China is an example of a powerful state. Apart from the good roads and modern seaports, state-of-the-art subways, stable electricity, and expensive airports. So I would say that this is a very common impression of the China model. And the Chinese state media tends to like to publish these types of statements because it thinks that these statements are praising China for good reasons. But in fact, outside of China, these types of statements are not perceived as a compliment. Particularly in the press, this impression of China model as top-down governance and massive investments is actually perceived as a threat rather than as praise. So one very common buzzword that is now popular in America is the idea of sharp power. This is a concept that is proposed by the National Foundation, by the National Endowment of Democracy. And if you go online, you can see numerous essays and op-eds that use the term sharp power. The idea of sharp power is the claim that China aims to portray the country as a successful example of economic development without democratic political institutions. And because of this impression of the China model, this in large part explains the rising tension that we see between China and the US today. This impression that China is completely opposite to Western liberal democratic values. Okay. So I would like to sort of highlight two common misunderstandings about the China model. What I'm going to do today is to debunk this misunderstanding and propose to you my take on the China model based on over 10 years of on-the-ground research about what really happened in China since market opening in 1978. So the first common misunderstanding about the China model is that this is a model that is all about top-down governance, and that it is the antithesis of democracy. It is the enemy of democracy, some would say. And I would want to say that this is a misunderstanding, a misperception. It is wrong because, in fact, the real China model is a combination of top-down direction and bottom-up participation. And this aspect of bottom-up participation is actually absolutely essential to China's economic success. Except these elements took place within a one-party system rather than in a conventional democratic political system. The other common misunderstanding is that following the China model means that you build infrastructure, you spend a lot of money. You build roads and highways and dams, and governmental reforms don't matter. And that is not true, because infrastructure was definitely important to China's own development, but governmental and institutional reforms were just as important for China's development and success. And one of the things that really strike me about China, having studied this country for a long time, is that the government and the bureaucracy is constantly updating and reforming itself. In fact, because I specialize in the study of Chinese bureaucracy, every 6 months I have to update my conclusion, because every 6 months they seem to have some type of whole new slew of reforms being introduced in the bureaucracy. So this bureaucracy, despite not having the forms of Western democracy, is in fact constantly adapting and constantly changing itself. So in short, what is the real China model? I would like to propose that the real China model should be understood as directed improvisation. What this means is that within China's one-party system, you have a combination of top-down direction that is provided by the central leadership in Beijing, combined with bottom-up improvisation using local existing resources by numerous local governments spread out throughout China. And it is a combination of this top-down direction and bottom-up improvisation that creates a pattern of diverse solutions tailored to local conditions and different stages of development throughout China. So we often have this impression of China as a homogeneous nation state, and that Beijing makes a command and everything is carried out in the same way. That is not true. If you ever had a chance to visit China and study the country, you'll be amazed at just the sheer diversity of local economic models and local solutions. And behind this is directed improvisation. A different way to understand directed improvisation in political terms is what I would call democratic characteristics within a one-party system. So if you think about what bottom-up improvisation and diverse solutions is doing, is that it is partially achieving the following qualities: partial limits on power, accountability, competition, experiments and feedback, and diverse solutions. Now, if you look at this list of attributes on its own, you would think, well, that's what a democracy is supposed to achieve, right? And our common impression is that you can only achieve these benefits by adopting the forms of Western democracy. China's innovation is that it kept the apparatus of a single-party system, and that's because the reforms leader, Deng Xiaoping, was very wise. He was very pragmatic, and he decided that in order to ensure political stability at a very difficult time, he would keep the Chinese Communist Party in power, but he also did something different, which is that he injected these democratic characteristics into the one-party system through bureaucratic reforms rather than formal political reforms. And through this hybrid political system that China created, they can leverage both the political stability of a non-democratic system, but at the same time leverage the highly creative and flexible benefits of democratic features. In short, if we talk about what should we learn from the China model, what the China model is, I just want you to remember that the China model is really about the democratic characteristics. It is the democratic characteristics that makes China successful. The difference in China is that these qualities and features manifest within a one-party system. Okay? So that is a summary of my take on the China model. In the rest of my talk, I'd like to share with you, just sort of tell you the story of China. And because of limited time, I won't go into all my details, but I'd just like to give you sort of a flavor of what the story is and how I go about telling it. And then we will move to some thoughts and suggestions about what lessons we can draw from Cambodia, from China's phenomenal success, and finally I'll conclude with a few thoughts. So this China story, if you have a copy of my book, you see that this is the book cover. And when we were designing the book cover, I had a lot of deliberations with my editor, and I made very sure to my editor that please, we will not have pictures of dragons and tigers or pandas. We don't want to have stereotypical images in this book. And so I actually took the initiative to look for many, many images and photos, hoping to find the right one. So this image was actually found and selected by me. When you look at this image, most people would think this is a picture of probably Guizhou, or Guangxi, or Sichuan, one of the poor western provinces in China today. But in fact, it's not. I picked this picture because this is a picture of Guangdong province in 1982. And if you know anything about China, Guangdong province is the birthplace of China's phenomenal capitalism. These children are standing on a mountaintop and they're looking at a new highway being built in the distance. I picked this picture so as to remind readers that only a generation ago, China was actually a really poor country. And how they managed to make this rapid transformation is the real puzzle that we are trying to grapple with. So before I go into my story, I think it's very helpful for me to give the audience a few facts so that we are all on the same page. Now, fact number one, it's really useful to bear in mind that prior to market reform, which began in 1978, this year will be the 40th anniversary, China was a very poor country. And sometimes we forget that because we read so much about China's rise, we see so much signs of China's wealth, we actually forget that they were a very poor country. So if you look at GDP per capita in 1964, China was actually poorer than Bangladesh and poorer than Cambodia. 1964, by the way, is just when the Cultural Revolution in China was about to begin. Right? So the starting point in China is actually incredibly low. The difference, however, is if you look at what happened between 1964 and 2014. It is the phenomenal increase in China's GDP from a very low starting point, the magnitude of which greatly surpasses countries like Bangladesh and Cambodia, even though these countries have in fact also achieved rapid growth. Right? So this is very remarkable about China, the magnitude of change that they achieved despite the fact that the starting point was actually very low. Now the second fact to know, as we turn from the economy to the politics, is that reforms in China began under a devastated, non-technocratic bureaucracy, not a strong state as we perceive today. Right? The strong state that you see in China today is the outcome of economic growth. It was not the cause of economic growth. So it's important to lay out some facts. During the 3 decades under Mao's rule, the Chinese people suffered incredible chaos and suffering. They went through the Great Leap Forward, which was the world's largest man-made famine. This is followed by the Cultural Revolution from 1965 to 1975, which was basically a 10-year period of mass killings and mutual beatings. And even Mao Zedong himself had said that this was a time of utter chaos and all-out civil war. The Cultural Revolution in particular devastated the bureaucracy because government officials were the main targets of persecution, tortures, and beatings. These pictures, by the way, are university students in China who managed to find some weapons and are shooting at each other. So this is just to give you a vivid sense that China did not begin on a strong footing. Right? And the other thing to bear in mind is that although today China has a really efficient technocratic bureaucracy, they did not begin with such a bureaucracy. One study finds that in the 1960s, the average education of local leaders in China was 6.5 years. Right? So this is not a great amount of schooling. So this is not at all a technocratic bureaucracy that you see in China today. So both the economic and the institutional starting points were low. The third fact is that China is the world's most successful case of poverty reduction, but this feat of lifting 700 million people out of poverty was achieved primarily through rapid growth. So a policy of a rising tide raises all boats, but not through anti-poverty policies. And that is why, if you look at the Gini coefficient in China, which is a measure of inequality, you'll see that by 2012, China's Gini coefficient was almost at the same level as the United States. If you look at the Gini coefficient of wealth rather than income, the inequality is even greater. And so it seems paradoxical that on the one hand, China has massively reduced absolute poverty, but on the other hand, it seems to have a great inequality problem. But if you understand how they did it, which is through rapid growth, this paradoxical pattern will actually make sense. So this is something to keep in mind. And that is why, in response to inequality, President Xi Jinping in 2012, when he came to office, advanced a very aggressive anti-poverty campaign that was targeted at the poorest people in the countryside. And fact number 4 is always worth reminding everyone, China is a really, really big country. If you look at China's provinces by population, each province is really like a mid-sized country. And Cambodia's population is roughly equivalent to Tianjin city, right? And so because of this massive scale in China, we try to understand how is it that China transformed itself from a low economic and political starting point. We cannot think about the China, this nation, as a homogeneous whole, but instead we need to break it apart and look at what happened in different parts of the country. So to just illustrate my argument, I am going to sort of show you the steps of what happened in the development process on the coastal parts of China. This is the part of China that got rich before the rest of the country. So one of the cases featured in my book is what I call a pseudonym, Forest Hill City, which is in Fujian province. Fujian province is the province that is closest to Taiwan. It is a coastal province. But Forest Hill City is less advantaged than, say, Xiamen, because it is in the inland area of Fujian province. And because it has this mixture of geographical advantages and disadvantages, it is a very ideal case for mapping out the development process, because I call it my Goldilocks case. It's neither too fast nor too slow. In some parts of China, it's very fast, like on fast forward. In other parts of China, it's like on pause mode. It's very slow. So this is an ideal case. But even though this Forest Hill City is not among the richest in China, it is not Shenzhen or Guangzhou, it nevertheless, like many other cities, have undergone rapid economic and institutional transformation. So this is the downtown of the city, and you can just see sort of visually the changes in the downtown from the 1970s, 80s, and today. The other change that you don't see in the picture is changes in the nature and the quality of government. This was a city government that began under the Maoist period. There are usually about 20,000 public employees in the bureaucracy who had not much formal education and certainly no exposure to the outside world, no experience in capitalist management. But today, when you go to interview and visit the city, you see a city bureaucracy that is efficient, high quality, determined, professional, and even able to advise its domestic companies how to invest overseas in countries like Cambodia, right? And all of this happened in only one generation. So how did this sort of story unfold? Like, what was the first step? Now, if we were to follow conventional wisdom in global development, what we would expect is, well, first, in this particular city government, you need to have a professional, high-quality, technocratic bureaucracy, and you need to establish universal best practices in order to stimulate the economy. So if we believe in the conventional wisdom, what we expect to see in the 1980s and 1990s is that this city should first eradicate corruption, establish private property rights, advance transparency, fire the bureaucrats who are redundant and not qualified, and hire technocrats. But the reality is nothing like that. And what I've done in my research is to interview more than 400 bureaucrats and enterprises asking for their oral histories, their recollection of what had happened from the 1980s to today. And this is a very, very interesting exercise because I often find things that completely surprise me and that is not documented anywhere. So what really happened in cities like Forest Hill is that in the 80s and 90s, because the national government had given the green light for them to embrace capitalist reforms and to attract foreign investors, and there was tremendous regional competition, not only at the provincial level, but among cities, among counties, even among townships and villages. And bear in mind, this is a bureaucracy that came from the Maoist period. They're not technocrats, and you cannot fire anyone, right? So what can you do with this bureaucracy? What they did was actually very unconventional, but also, to give them credit, quite creative. What the city government did is that it enlisted all the civil servants in the bureaucracy, usually about, on average, 20,000 of them, regardless of what your functions are, regardless of your office, as long as you work in the government, you are supposed to use your personal relationships to recruit investors. Call your friends, call your relatives, go to Taiwan, just use your personal relationships to get those investors to come to the city. Then in order to incentivize this behavior, the civil servants are also allowed to take a cut of the investments made. So they can take 2%, 5%, and in the Chinese context, like in all other developing countries, formal pay is very low. Right? Formal pay is below subsistence. So what these civil servants are really living on is what is like the sales commission that they get from the developmental behavior. And then at the same time, they also took advantage of the communist system, which is that the government set concrete targets for every agency. For example, every year you have to bring in X million of investments to the city. So if you look at these three practices, you would think from the conventional wisdom perspective, this is absolutely problematic. This is wrong. This is not best practices. But if you think about it in the context of an early stage of development, it actually is very complementary with that particular context because they have to use what they have. And if what you have is a communist bureaucracy with civil servants having, or if you think about it, what is the biggest resource of civil servants? Personal connections. So why don't you use their personal connections to serve a collective developmental good? Right? So even though these practices are inconsistent with what we think of as best practices, it actually fitted the context of early development in China really well. So the lesson here, if you just look at the first stage of this city's development, is that normatively weak or wrong institutions can be functionally strong, and that we need to make a distinction between the functions of institutions and the forms that take. You can achieve developmental functions by a variety of forms. And what is unique in China is that they were very pragmatic, and they would take any forms and invent any forms in order to achieve their goals. But this is not the end of the story. This is only the beginning of the story. From there, the story continued to evolve. By the 2000s, the city had experienced a rapid economic takeoff. This economic change by itself actually changes the government because it changes the amount of resources that people have, and it also changes the goals of development. Once you're no longer very poor, you're not desperate for investments of any type. You want good quality investments, you want high quality investments, and you have more resources to use. And so today, if you visit the very same city, the bureaucracy is actually evolved, it's much more professionalized, much more consistent with what you might find in Singapore, and this professionalized bureaucracy serves to preserve an established market. Right? So this is in very, very sort of stylized terms, the three-step process of development in this one Chinese city. Now, if we were to strip away the details and ask ourselves, what is the generic lesson, the generic model that we learn from this process, I would sum it up in these three steps. The three steps of development are actually to start by harnessing normatively weak institutions to build markets. If you think about what is the common feature of all low-income developing economies, the common feature is that they have plenty of normatively weak institutions. And we normally look at these normatively weak institutions as obstacles, as nothing but problems. If only I could get rid of corruption, if only I could get rid of technocrats who are not qualified, if only I could get rid of these problems, then we will have development. But that's not practical. That's not how development happens. How development happens is you use what you have, not what you want. And that is exactly what you see in China. The step two is that once you are able to kickstart this development process, the emergence of markets itself will stimulate the selection of conventionally good or strong institutions because it is now aligned with the preferences as well as the capacity of the government. And the third step is that conventionally strong institutions preserve markets. Here there is one concept that I want to highlight, the difference between building markets and preserving markets. And in development theory, we have not made that distinction enough, right? What happens in developed Western economies is that they have really good institutions. These institutions are premised on the creation of markets. But when you are in a low-income country, when markets have not yet been created, getting the strong institutions is the problem. So you need to start with what you have. And if normatively weak institutions are what you have, then get creative. Use them, repurpose them to serve the goals of early development. So that is one critical and unusual lesson that I wanted to highlight from China. Now, if you look at this three-step process, this takes us to a much more complex and a much more challenging question, which is why is it that in China, local governments are able to adapt constantly? Why are they willing to take initiative and why are they willing to even take a lot of policy risk? Right? It's because for this policy, this process to unfold, you need your local actors to be very proactive. So what is it about China that makes the local actors so proactive? And a lot of Chinese people will say it's culture. That's not true, because under Maoism, you saw none of this. Right? In the early parts of China, you saw none of this. So it must be that something had happened, something had changed in the political system that enables them to act in this very adaptive, flexible, and proactive way. So this is where I would like to take you from bottom-up improvisation using existing resources to the underlying political directions from Beijing that enables local actors to act, to behave in the way they did. And these top-down directions come in a bundle of different strategies. They include the strategy of granting flexibility, but not too much, clearly defining what is bureaucratic success and what are the goals of development, having incentives and penalties, a lot of them, and very high-powered incentives throughout the bureaucratic system, initiating reforms in connected domains or connected policy areas, and pairing rich and poor. So one of the things I would like to highlight when you look at this list of action is that they are not commands. They're not Beijing telling these local governments, this is exactly what you should do. I'm commanding that you do this. What you see is a change in the role of the central government from a dictator to a director. The government is trying to create the conditions and enabling environment for its local actors to create solutions that are tailored to their local conditions. So we don't have time to go through all of these actions, but I wanted to highlight for you the first one. Grant flexibility, but not too much, because I think this is one of the most fascinating but least understood aspect of China's political system. If you think about the problem of what I call variation, it is expressed in this form. Beijing, the central government, wants local governments to exercise flexibility when implementing central mandates. And again, bearing in mind, China is a really big country, 31 provinces. The entire civil service, from the top to the bottom, has 50 million individuals. That is several times bigger than Cambodia's whole population. We're talking about a really massive organization, right? So the central government wants these local governments to exercise flexibility when implementing central mandates because their local conditions are so different. And if they have no flexibility, then the implementation is not going to be effective. In other words, too little flexibility leads to rigidity, and too much flexibility leads to chaos. to express the problem differently. If you were a central leader in China, how can you grant autonomy, but not too much and not always, right? Because sometimes you may want them to have autonomy, sometimes you may not want them to have autonomy, and that might vary by policy areas. So how do they actually calibrate the amount of autonomy? And the answer that I find through my research is that Beijing does so by issuing commands in varying degrees of clarity. And I think many people don't notice that, because if you read textbooks about China, what they will tell you is that in China, national policies emphasize broad principles rather than specific instructions. And these slogans like harmonious development, scientific development, or socialism with Chinese characteristics will direct the flow of policy implementation at all levels. This is the conventional wisdom about the Chinese political system. But if you think about this conventional wisdom carefully, it doesn't quite make sense in several ways. The first puzzle that comes to me is that China is such a complex country with such difficult governance challenges. How can you govern such a big country with just vague slogans? Right? That's a bit hard to believe. The second thing is that in China, the leadership has such incredible amount of power. So if you have so much power, why don't you tell me what you want me to do? Like, why are you being vague or cryptic? Why do you want to do that? Right? So these are sort of really puzzling questions about, this doesn't seem to quite make sense. So I propose actually a different understanding of how political communication works in China. And this is actually intrinsically tied with its development strategy. Are political commands in China, in fact, always broad and vague? They're not. What you actually find in China's political communications is, and this is of course a simplification, 3 varieties of commands. And I would group them into red policies, black policies, and gray policies. Let me explain what I mean. Red policies are directions, regulations that come out of Beijing that clearly forbids a particular action. In these types of policies, the language is actually very clear. These are the red lines, and if you cross it, you will be penalized. Sometimes you will be actually charged with a criminal crime. So these are policies for which Beijing takes very seriously. A good example is land quotas. Every locality in China has a certain quota of land that they can sell. And they cannot violate this quota because the local leader would have to be personally liable for violating this rule. A second type of policies, which is really a fascinating feature of Chinese politics, is what I call gray directives. You find this a lot in Chinese politics to varying degrees. These are directives that come out of Beijing that are deliberately unclear and vague, and because they don't say whether you can do something or cannot do something, it actually permits or creates space for bounded experimentation at the local levels. And by having these gray policies and allowing space for bounded experimentation, if the feedback from the bottom up suggests that this initiative of experiment works, then that experiment would be scaled up across the nation in what I call a black policy, meaning a policy that very clearly states that Beijing sanctions a particular action. And so these signals actually do have a very real and strong impact on the way development happens in China. And just to give an example, this is about collective enterprises in China. In the 1980s, when China was just opening its markets, private enterprises were not allowed. So as a kind of a hybrid and a compromise, the central government allowed localities to set up collective enterprises in the name of township and village governments. But if you look at 1980 to 1984, this experiment happened very cautiously because Beijing was vague, but it never really said, yes, you can do this. And over the course of 4 years, Beijing very carefully observed and collected feedback on whether this particular experiment, which by the way, Deng Xiaoping did not think of, he repeatedly said that he was utterly surprised by this invention, which came from the poorest parts of China, from the villages. And after collecting the feedback and determining that, yes, this works for our whole country, in 1984, they issued a very clear directive saying, yes, we endorse collective enterprises. And so you can see this huge jump from 84 onwards in the number of collective enterprises. So this one example illustrates for you what is Beijing's role in the political system. It is to provide room for experimentation, to generate policy feedback, and to scale success nationwide, as well as to disallow failed local experiments. Okay? So you can see that the role of Beijing, far from the often sort of top-down impression that we have, is actually an enabler of solutions. What I want to stress is that the role of Beijing in granting autonomy is only one part of a whole package of directions that it provides. Incentives are just as important, the accountability system, the way it's able to connect reforms across domains and so forth. And so I think in trying to learn from China, it's important not to just copy one thing, but to understand this one particular reform, what is its relationship to other connected reforms. Right? But overall, I hope that by telling you this story, you get some concrete sense of what I'm saying when I talk about directed improvisation. I hope it gives you a concrete sense of what top-down direction from Beijing looks like, and how this direction enables bottom-up improvisation using existing resources across different parts of China. So with that understanding of the China model in mind, I now move on to, I think, the important question that this audience cares deeply about, which is, what are the lessons for Cambodia? Because as we read from the media, there's a lot of discussion about exactly what other developing countries should learn from China. And before I share my thoughts, I think it's important for me to highlight three general principles about learning. The first general principle is that I think we really need to bear in mind that learning does not equal copying. Right? We should learn from China because its experience is so valuable and unusual, but we shouldn't copy exactly what China did. Because if we did so, then we are falling into the same trap of the past of copying Western best practices. Right? And whenever you copy something wholesale that does not fit your country's conditions, it is not going to work. So I think we need, at the outset, to make a very clear distinction that learning is not the same as copying. And in general, copying is not a good idea because it may not fit the reality of your country. The second principle I wanted to highlight is that other countries should learn both from China's remarkable success, but also from China's mistakes and costs. There's a tendency, because China today is so wealthy and powerful, that we might think that everything that China does must be correct. Everything that China does must be good and successful, and so we'll copy the whole thing. And that is absolutely wrong. And I believe that even my colleagues and many people, elites in China would agree with me, that China's development did have many mistakes and failures along the way. China's development did come at a high social cost. Right? So we want to be able, as much as possible, to learn from China's successes, but at the same time to avoid repeating China's mistakes and costs. And I think that's absolutely important. The third thing that other countries should bear in mind is that I think we have a lot to learn from the Chinese system of directed improvisation, but it must be adapted to the conditions of a democratic context. Because almost all developing countries around the world have elections. They are democracies. So the formal forms of their political system are fundamentally different from a one-party system. It doesn't mean that we cannot learn from China, because what you see in China is a one-party system variant of directed improvisation, but directed improvisation can be applied and modified to fit a democratic context. So I want to share my thoughts about the implications of the Chinese model for Cambodia, focusing on 2 misunderstandings and 3 lessons. So the first misunderstanding that I think is important to clarify is the one that I had started out with, which is this very common misimpression that following the China model means to ignore democracy and governance issues. I think this is the most common one. And I wanted to iterate again that in fact, if you really study the Chinese experience and understand what are the ingredients that make them successful, you will see that it is actually the democratic qualities, such as competition, accountability, limits on power, bottom-up participation, and locally tailored solutions that help China become adaptive, flexible, and succeed to its present day. But the lesson that we should take from China is that democratic qualities need not take Western or Chinese forms. And I think the mistake that we have had in the past decades is assuming that we can only achieve democracy or the benefits of democratic qualities by copying the political system of the West. And that has been a mistake, because China shows that you can approximate the benefits of these qualities even in a one-party system. That does not mean, however, that any country should copy China's political system. It just means that democratic qualities really do matter. So in Cambodia, these qualities do not have to take Western forms, they do not have to take Chinese forms, but they need to take some form. They need to take a Cambodian form, right? So what the Cambodian forms should take, it is the Cambodian experts and the Cambodian government and the Cambodian people would know best how to manifest these democratic qualities in their political system. The second misunderstanding, I think, which is very common, is that following the China model means it's okay to tolerate low quality growth and clean up later. And if you recall the story that I told you about Forest Hill, it does seem to support this argument. Because recall my story, in a city like Forest Hill in the 1980s and 1990s, they were very indiscriminate about investment. There was very little coordination, it was chaotic, it was messy, it was corrupt, they welcomed all investments, it damaged the environment, but because of this en masse, very aggressive efforts to push economic growth, they did have rapid capital accumulation, right? And then it is much later on, today, when you go to these coastal cities, that you see a very sharp change in the preferences of these local governments. They say that we no longer want all kinds of investments. We want good quality investments. We want to be selective about our development. We want high quality development. And they're trying very hard to clean up the consequences of their early growth strategies. So if you look at this story on its own, you might think that this story seems to justify the argument that it's okay for other developing countries to tolerate low quality growth and clean up later. And I wanted to emphasize in my remarks that this is not necessarily the case. And let me explain why. In my trip to Cambodia this time, I had a chance to visit Sihanoukville, which, as everyone knows, is really a very important test case for development that is very much powered and engineered by Chinese investments and aid. I wanted to emphasize that in Sihanoukville that we really do see many positive aspects of Chinese investments and aid. For example, there's a highway from Sihanoukville to the capital city that is being built. And this type of infrastructure projects obviously will greatly enhance transportation links. I also want to emphasize that we saw special economic zones, one of which employed as many as 20,000 workers in the region. Right? So there are many positive aspects of Chinese investments that we saw in this place. But the other thing that we also saw in this place, which will be obvious to any visitor who goes to Sihanoukville, is that you can find casinos of all varieties, big, small, all kinds of fancy names. The names are usually very interesting. One casino was called The Rich, and it was built right opposite the office of the governor, right? And so you see this visually, just this massive explosion of this particular type of investment. And the locals, understandably, were very concerned about this. And so I think when we look at this situation and we think about China's own experiences, we might think about what are some lessons that we can draw. And if you focus on the story that I told you about China, we might think, this should be okay in Xi'anville. Because in a coastal city in China, it took them about, I would say, 15 to 20 years to make the evolution from step 1 to step 3. So maybe in time, the situation in Xi'anville will also improve, and that these sort of indiscriminate welcoming of all investments is a necessary first step of economic growth. But there are some critical differences that I want to highlight. The first critical difference is that in places like Forest Hill, even in Shenzhen, they did have low-quality manufacturing projects. So in Forest Hill in particular, they had a lot of cement and paper factories, which were very low-end and very polluting. But these types of low-end manufacturing are not the same as having a lot of casinos, right? Because when you have a lot of casinos and you bring in the gambling industry, understandably, you will bring in activities associated with this industry. It forms an ecosystem. And this ecosystem will, I think, have deep social and will have deep and enduring social impact. So in Forest Hill today, they are in the process of trying to get rid of these low-end polluting industries that they had in the past. It is not always easy for them to do so. And if you just try to project what it might look like 10 to 20 years from now, I think it will be much harder for a province like Xi'anville to evolve out of a model of development that is dominated by a particular gambling industry than it is for a Chinese city to evolve itself out of low-end manufacturing, right? So the short answer is not all low-quality investments are the same, right? And that's something important to bear in mind. The other lesson that is important to bear in mind is that China went through this particular process because from the very beginning, they had a very narrow definition of development as capital accumulation. And they were fine with that. They decided that in their particular circumstances, the most important thing was capital accumulation, and that they were prepared to pay a price for it. Although they weren't sure exactly how big this price will be 10, 20 years down the road, but they're willing to pay for it. But I think other developing countries seeking to develop their society and economy should start by asking themselves, what kind of development do you want? Because if you want this type of development that gets you rapid capital accumulation, it does come with social costs. And you should know about the costs because China already provides us with a lot of prior experience about what this cost looks like. And this is an interview that I did with one government official in Forest Hill City. In this interview, I had asked him, do you think that inland provinces in China should replicate the experience of the coastal provinces? Because bear in mind that provincial development in China is very uneven. The coasts are very prosperous and modern, but the inland areas, some of them are at similar or even lower levels of development than Cambodia, right? So it's very uneven. So I asked him, do you think that inland provinces should copy the experiences of Fujian, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu? And he said, of course inland provinces should walk their own path and not follow us, coastal provinces, blindly. In the beginning, our slogan was, let the water run fast. That is, make as much money as possible, no matter how polluting, which therefore left behind many problems. The cost of fixing them today exceeds the money we made in the past. And so this is a statement not made by me, but it comes straight out of China from the thoughts of a coastal government official. So I think other countries seeking to learn from China should really realistically take into account his advice. Now that I've talked about two misunderstandings, I would like to turn to a positive note and talk about 3 lessons that we might take that could be applied potentially to a country like Cambodia. The first lesson that I would suggest, and again, the actual application of it would really have to depend on the knowledge of Cambodian experts, is that I think Cambodia could benefit with more decentralization. But this decentralization mustn't be chaotic, of course. It needs to be paired with the right direction and right incentives from the national government. Now, this little chart here is just to give you an indication of the differences in decentralization between Cambodia and China. China is one of the world's most decentralized administration, despite the fact that it's a one-party political system. So this is a chart that shows you subnational spending as a share of total spending. In China, it is as high as 70%. So local governments take a lot of responsibility for governing their own jurisdictions. By comparison, Cambodia is one of the least decentralized countries in the world. Only 17%. It's even less decentralized than Indonesia and much less so than Vietnam. Right? So I think Cambodia has a lot of room for thinking about decentralization. I want to stress, of course, that Cambodia should not replicate or copy China's unusually high degree of decentralization. Again, it's not about copying. China is very decentralized, in part because it is such a large country. So there is no need to exactly copy China to that extent. But I do think that decentralization has its benefits for Cambodia's development. And one of the benefits was something that I witnessed for myself during my site visit to Sihanoukville. One of the things that you notice about local leaders is that the problems that occur in that particular province, he sees them, he faces them, he deals with the complaints, he lives in that place. And so just by the fact that he is physically in that province, he is much more motivated to deal with local problems. Right? So that is one benefit, just a very straightforward one. So if you let these local government actors, a local civil society, the people who live in the place and have a stake in that society to have a role in development, they're much, much more motivated to do it well. So that is one very clear benefit of decentralization. But decentralization is not something easy. And in China, they have been very thoughtful about how to do decentralization. And one of the key issues, I don't have an answer, but it is a difficult one, is how can you align the incentives of local governments with development and national goals? That is a perennial problem, even in China. And they constantly have to tweak their solution to this problem. So I think if Cambodia is interested, willing to think about more decentralization, at the same time, more thought needs to be put into designing incentives. How do you get these local actors to really have a personal stake in development? And how do you get these local actors to be aligned with national development goals? Okay? So this is a question for which I think the audience may have better answers than I do. The other lesson from China, which I think is a lesson that is completely neglected, that people have not paid attention to, is that China is actually a very excellent illustration of leveraging local indigenous resources for economic development. And again, the sort of slogan for this is use what you have. Right? In the Chinese context, as you saw in my example, they were very creative. They took whatever works for them. They took a little bit of communism with a little bit of personal relationships that are common in all countrysides, a little bit from the Russians, a little bit from the Westerners. They took whatever that is useful to them, and then they combine them into a package of strategy that suits their particular stage of development in that particular place. So I think when Cambodia wants to apply these lessons, it needs to sort of reflect upon what does Cambodia have. And I think when we look at developing countries, we tend to think, oh, these countries, they are devastated, they're poor, they have nothing. And I want to challenge that perception. I think that developing countries do have something. It's just that we have not given credit to the resources that they have. And I think if we take China's experience seriously, it is a fine illustration that if you look carefully, there are local resources to tap upon. So these are just some thoughts that come to mind. And again, it is the Cambodian experts who would know better what Cambodia has. Things like communal and family networks, things like diaspora, not only the Cambodian diaspora from overseas, but the urban diaspora who go home to their villages. The informal sector is actually really vibrant in Cambodia, but throughout sort of my discussions in the past days, they've often been sort of sidelined and marginalized rather than being included in the National Development Plan. And religion might potentially play a positive role as well, because in many societies, a religion has functioned as a kind of social welfare provider. So these are just some ideas. I'm not prescribing or advocating them, but I'm just trying to stimulate some ideas for what is it that you can use in Cambodia at this current stage of development. Now, very obviously, Chinese investments is a great resource at this particular point in time. This is something that Cambodia has. But in order to leverage the benefits of this resource and asset, it is important to integrate Chinese investments with local elements in Cambodia and to spread the benefits widely. And then I get to my third lesson, and then we'll be ready to conclude. The third lesson from China is that China's success lies in large part on giving a broad scope of actors a personal stake in development. And this almost sounds cliche, like a line you would read in a good governance report. But the trick in China is that they had practiced this principle in a one-party system. And they did so by early on, not so much liberalizing civil society, but actually using the civil service as a substitute for civil society. Because bearing in mind, the civil service in China is very big. It has 50 million individuals. If you can activate the potential among this organization, who happen to have usually the highest social connections in China, and if you can mobilize the initiative of these people to serve national development goals, why not? Right? So the Chinese very deliberately activated the potential of the civil service, using it to substitute for civil society. And China substituted political reforms with bureaucratic reforms. The other thing to bear in mind is that when we talk about development in Cambodia, I think there's a lot of emphasis on special economic zones, industrial parks, mass industrialization. And if you look at China today, it seems to be that, yes, China had industrialized its way out of prosperity. One of the things that we tend to forget is that before China had mass industrialization that happened in the cities, China began with rural industrialization. China's first success was rural and agricultural reforms. And rural and agricultural reforms actually contributed most to China's poverty reduction. 40% of the poverty reduction between 81 and 2004 remarkably happened within the first 3 years, because it happened in the countryside where 80% of Chinese people are. So if we want to spread the benefits of development broadly, it is important, as China did, to start from the countryside. And in China, this pattern of rural industrialization, even though they were eventually all privatized, helped to spawn the first generation of private enterprises in China, which today make up about 60% of China's GDP. Okay? So these are 3 lessons that we can consider from China's experience in Cambodia's context, which are, I hope, very different from what we conventionally perceive. To conclude, I wanted to say that I have always argued that China is a textbook case of #adaptive development. So if you go on Twitter, if you're live tweeting, you can check out this hashtag. And what this hashtag means is that it is a sort of a new development paradigm in global development. The idea that one size fits all best practices that is outdated. We tested them for 20 years. They don't really work. Sometimes they backfire. So now we need to embrace a different set of values: adaptive development, complexity, innovation. And the UNDP has been a big embracer of innovation and development. The phrase adaptive management you can find in all kinds of development and aid agencies. And I think this is a fact that even China does not quite appreciate or realize, which is that China had practiced the principles of adaptive development, complexity, and innovation long before they became fashionable in global development. So today, if you go to the global development literature, what you find is a lot of theories, sort of prescriptions about what adaptive development should look like. If you try to see in these literature, what is your exact evidence? What does it exactly look like if you do adaptive development? There's not much evidence. And in fact, you can find a ton of evidence and lessons from China's 40 years of development experience, which actually illustrates adaptive development. So I think the big message for China and also for the world is that I think China really has a lot of potential for advancing global development, not only by exporting capital and building infrastructure, which is very important, but also by sharing Chinese wisdom. And this is a phrase used by Chinese President Xi Jinping himself, which means that China actually does have a lot of soft capital from its own experience. It's just that I think it hasn't quite theorized that experience. It hasn't quite realized that it has practiced adaptive development and hasn't quite figured out when it goes out to the world, how can it really share the positive aspects of its development rather than just bringing a lot of money? And so the conclusion is that I think the world could have potentially a lot more benefits if China could promote adaptive development, directed improvisation, beyond spending and building, which are good, and that should be continued to be done. But at the core of adaptive development is respecting local conditions, using indigenous resources. So in embracing adaptive development, I think this is actually not in conflict with China's principle of non-interference. And I think if China could understand that this is its strength, and this is something worth sharing with other developing countries, it would really help to promote sustainable development in other parts of the world. For countries like Cambodia, I think it's very important to take the right lessons from China's experience, not the wrong lessons, right? So we should not be thinking incorrectly that from China, we should learn only top-down governance and industrial parks. In fact, the China model often offers far, far more than these things. And finally, I would like to suggest that while China provides the critical hardware of development so far, in the form of infrastructure projects and capital, I think that I am very honored to be here at this event hosted by UNDP, because I think UNDP can really play a useful, positive role in helping to humanize this hardware, and helping developing countries to understand that behind the infrastructure and the capital we see in China are actually many, many institutional and governmental reforms, and many aspects of adaptive development that we can modify and apply to the context of countries like Cambodia. So on that note, thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to your reactions. Thank you.